Ladies and gentlemen, ministers, distinguished delegates, in the rules-based order of the Shangri-La Dialogue, we try to start on time. We had to extend the second session by 10 or 15 minutes owing to the important statement and Q&A session we had in the first plenary. We were delighted with the richness of our discussions in the second plenary with a really good debate on what the next steps needed to be on the Korean Peninsula to achieve that vision of peace and security in that region of East Asia, whose stability has not just regional but global implications. And we heard, in fact, in the second plenary by the ministers of defense of Korea and Japan, who were speaking about the Korean Peninsula, that security and defense in the Indo-Pacific required trans-regional cooperation. And both the Minister of Defense of Korea and Japan cited the important engagement of the European Union, but also specifically of key European states in upholding the rules-based order in the Asia-Pacific and ensuring that specifically the sanctions imposed on North Korea were enforced and not only repeated rhetorically. We heard from the Prime Minister of Singapore last night on the importance of small states being able to maintain their diplomatic room for maneuver at a time when there was a good deal of great power competition. And it's important for us always to hear on the first day of the Shangri-La Dialogue a perspective from ASEAN. So we've packaged together the third plenary session with all of those perspectives in mind. The theme of this session is rather grandly titled Asia's Evolving Security Order and Its Challenges. It gives license to each of our three speakers to pick out exactly what they want to prioritize, and I know each of them will have done that. It's a delight for us to have with us Haji Muhammad Sabu, the Minister of Defense of Malaysia, who joined us for his first Shangri-La Dialogue last year, soon after his appointment to this post, and it's a real pleasure that this year he will be formally addressing the dialogue. I mentioned last night that just 1 month after her appointment, we were delighted to receive at the Shangri-La Dialogue Penny Mordaunt, our Secretary of State for Defense in the United Kingdom, who has previous experience in the Ministry of Defense, having been a Minister of State for the Armed Forces and having actually served also as a Naval Reserve officer. So this is not a mandate that she has taken on without very long preparation and experience. And it's, of course, a pleasure again to receive Florence Parly, the Minister of the Armed Forces of France, who addressed the dialogue last year and has come this year accompanied by a strong delegation, but also a rather large boat in the form of the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier that is now stationed at Changi Naval Base and that some of you will have the privilege of boarding tomorrow afternoon. And so that is quite an important expression of the interest that France has in this region. So with that lengthy but necessary preface to settle the room, could I now invite the Minister of Defense of Malaysia, Mohammed Sabu, to address the third plenary.
Assalamu alaikum and very good morning. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed participants of Shangri-La Dialogue 2019. Foremost, I would like to thank IISS, we cannot pronounce IS, for the invitation and warm hospitality. This event has always been a conducive platform to synergize ideas and gain new insight on the current global security matters. Last year, for the first time, I came here as a participant to observe and understand the overall perspective and key issues of global security. Now I am deeply honored once again to attend and share my perspective on topic Asia involving security order and its challenges. The foundation of Asia-Pacific regional order evolved tremendously throughout the years, and new geopolitical landscape has emerged, fueled among others by high level of economic growth. Almost a decade ago, China overtook Japan to become Asia's largest economy, second worldwide to the United States in terms of gross domestic product. We observe that this and other forces are shifting the distribution of economic, political, and military power across the region. In this regard, I agree with the Prime Minister of Singapore, the speech he gave last night. The Asia-Pacific region also witnessed the realignment and restructuring of middle powers, foreign and security policies. Therein exists regional anxiety is smaller nations would be forced to take side, one that has detrimental implication in economic development and nation building. One of the greatest challenges facing us today is the complex security dynamics in Asia and Pacific region. It is the world's fastest growing economies and the fastest increasing military expenditures and naval capabilities. This fact reflects a bigger global security risk, especially when there is a strong evidence of fierce competition over natural resources and overlapping claims on strategic hotspots. The competition in the South China Sea has undeniably fractured the status quo regionalism and created a new coalition. I would categorize the security order scenario into three categories outlook. The first outlook portrays the challenge to oversee the uncertainty and complex regional order due to geopolitical competition. This outlook occurs due to the multipolar power structure manifested by the new U.S. administration and China's robust economy and security policy objective for this region. The uncertain relationship between U.S. and China will remain as an implicit factor in shaping the stability of the Asia-Pacific region, particularly of Southeast Asia countries. That also I agree with the Prime Minister of Singapore last night. The second strategic outlook foresees Southeast Asia in intra-ASEAN dynamic concerning overlapping border claims, large movement of refugees, and rise of internal conflict. The plight of Rohingya is sheer evidence of internal conflict, which has snowballed into a major humanitarian crisis. Malaysia's position on Rohingya issue is well known and consistent. We believe that the situation in Rakhine is no longer a domestic conflict. The ASEAN Charter spoke very strongly about the principle and non-interference, and Malaysia will continue to subscribe to this principle. However, beyond the humanitarian dimension, there are also the security and strategic dimension. The widespread movement of Rohingyas create instability in the region and could easily become a rallying call for violent extremism in the region. The third strategy outlook foresees the issue pertaining non-traditional security risks and emerging trends impacting the Asia region. This outlook will be the limelight in the coming future as it poses greater challenge. Maritime, violence, terrorism, and cybersecurity are main challenges which need to be addressed accordingly. The maritime violence, particularly sea piracy and robbery, requires a more collaborative approach among nations. Maritime issues will be potential threat among nations if concerted efforts are not tackled effectively. Obviously, the Southeast Asia waters have faced multifaceted challenges, ranging from traditional to non-traditional threat within its shores and beyond. The rivalry of the big powers aggravates tension in the South China Sea. As a result, there is a greater risk for naval ship and aircraft encounters, which pose possible clash that could spark major conflict, dragging ASEAN member states into it. One such issue in the South China Sea, which concerns the security and sustenance of many neighboring nations. The South China Sea should remain an area of peace, friendship, and trade, rather than one of confrontation and conflict, where ASEAN, the rest of the world, can leverage on our strategic location. Ladies and gentlemen, economic development flourishes in peaceful countries with sound security policies, and to achieve this, we need to raise the bar for tighter regional security cooperation, not by being reactive, but working strategically together. Within the defense sector, a stronger collaboration would increase our interoperability and capability in facing our common threat. For Malaysia, the nation's well-being is founded on strong and friendly relations with other countries and its commitment to the multilateral system. Malaysia will actively participate in the deliberation effort toward finding solutions to various global issues. Malaysia will continue with the principle of engagement and cooperation rather than isolationism and unilateral action. In response to the complexity in global affairs and expanding international relations, Malaysia's conduct will be guided by the principle of respect for independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference in the affairs of other nations, peaceful settlement of dispute, peaceful coexistence, and mutual benefit in relation. Lastly, I will take this opportunity to wish all Muslims Ramadan al-Mubarak and Eid Mubarak in advance for the coming Eid al-Fitr celebration. Before I end my speech, I wish to stress the virtue of togetherness in ensuring peace, retrieved from Henry Ford, quote, as working together, coming together is the beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. With that, thank you very much.
Mat Sabu, thank you very much for those remarks. And I think everyone will have been impressed by your simultaneous reminder of the important ASEAN principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign nations, but also your earlier comment that the problems of Rakhine State in Myanmar cannot be considered only a domestic issue. And I think this is an issue with which ASEAN is grappling a great deal now. With that, it gives me great pleasure to invite the Secretary of State of Defense of the United Kingdom, Penny Mordaunt, to address this plenary.
Your Excellencies, fellow ministers, distinguished guests, it's a privilege to be with you today. Thank you, IISS, for organizing an exceptional event, and thank you, Singapore, for your kind and generous hospitality. As your Prime Minister reminded us yesterday, as he set the tone for this dialogue, 200 years ago, Stamford Raffles' decision to create a free port won out over other ideas. His concept succeeded because it was of benefit to all. And as we contemplate the challenges in the region and the tensions globally, we should remember that lasting success depends on that win-win approach. Although new to this role, it has been my privilege to work with many nations across the region, whether it's delivering development or humanitarian programs to increase prosperity and combat the major shared challenges we face, from the protection of forests and biodiversity, to job creation, to combating illicit financial flows and organized crime, or building capacity by promoting ease of doing business and business integrity and the transparency of financial transactions, working together for the common good. To our 50 diplomatic missions across the region, we have added new ones, new posts, and a trade commissioner. The challenges we are working on are increasingly interlinked and transnational. Mutual benefit is what the UK stands for. Just like our hosts, Singapore, we are a win-win nation. We want all to be able to thrive, and every human being and every nation to be able to reach its full potential. Our peace and prosperity are bound to yours, but our collective security is under threat. Threats that have the potential to impact growth and trade, or our health and food security, whether from terrorism or organized crime, or threats to privacy, malicious cyber activity, or threats to regional stability from North Korea's illegal nuclear weapons program, or from proxies blurring the boundaries between normal and hostile activity. That is why we work to strengthen and protect the rules-based order and those multilaterals which enable the focus and close working needed to meet the challenges we all face. We need cooperation and we need partnership. Our vision is for a prosperous and stable region where we all act together for the common good. And we need rules that are there for the whole of humanity, not just the benefit of some. It is for those nations to decide if they wish to challenge those international norms and rules, or choose to gain all the benefits that cooperation brings. And I think we should all choose a future where those standards, whether they are in the maritime environment, in cyberspace, or in human rights law, drive the success and growth of this region. I am optimistic, though, about the future, and I want to tell you why. 4 years ago, as Minister of State for the Armed Forces, I've seen our nations working together to tackle Ebola in Sierra Leone. We were driven by our common humanity, but it was in all our interests that we were there. Because those of us who commit the men and women of our armed forces to UN peacekeeping efforts know that conflict perpetuated harms us all. Because those of us that ratified the Paris Climate Change Agreement recognized that collective action was needed to tackle that existential threat to us all. And because as a former disability minister, I've worked with all nations in the region as we together enabled millions of excluded people to have the chance of a new stake in life. And because of our work together through multilateral forums to make smart investments in human capital and infrastructure. I'm optimistic because I have seen that partnership, that commitment, and that contribution. The UK knows that to be a reliable global partner, we can have no half-hearted measures, and we are committed to being a reliable partner to you all. And that is why our engagement across the region is underpinned by our support for fundamental global values, human rights, democracy, and respect for the rules-based international order. Because seizing the opportunities present in this region demands the enforcement of rules and standards, standards that have raised people from poverty, standards that have delivered peace and prosperity, freedom and trade, standards that have made significant progress to preserve our shared environment, our climate, our air, our green spaces. And for global Britain, that means, first and foremost, that we need to be present, and that our presence must be persistent, not opportunistic. And that is why we have seen the Royal Navy maintain an almost unbroken presence in the region over the last 12 months, and why that will continue in the future, and will include our new flagship, HMS Queen Elizabeth, in one of her first operational deployments in a couple of years' time. And we will deepen relationships, and we will forge new ones. Building on our cooperation with ASEAN, which has done so much to promote vital regional dialogue, through our drive to expand the Regional Jungle Warfare Symposium with Brunei, building and sharing regional understanding, capability, and capacity to tackle the growing challenge posed by non-traditional security threats, through our work to deepen alliances with other regional partners like Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and India, to continue to commit and to exercise with FPDA, and shortly to deploy to Thailand for exercise Panther Gold, using the 2,000 Gurkhas and armed forces personnel based in Brunei and the region. So my message today to you all is a simple one. I look forward to working with you. The UK is a partner that you can rely on, and the UK will rely on and defend those values and norms upon which the fulfillment of the tremendous opportunities this region has depends. Global Britain stands ready, and we are optimistic about the future. Thank you.
Secretary of State, thank you very much for a defense speech that was so obviously informed by your experience also as Secretary of State for International Development, for your reminder that a rules-based order must extend through the maritime environment into cyberspace, but also into human rights law, and for showing the United Kingdom's intent to, so to speak, persistently engage in this region. With that, could I invite the Minister of the Armed Forces of France, Florence Parly, to address this third plenary. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Chipman, dear Penny Mordaunt, dear Matt Sabu, dear colleagues, fellow ministers, excellencies, and friends. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning, and I would like also to thank IISS for the fantastic quality of whatever they do, and of course our host. Singapore is a key strategic partner for France, as highlighted by Prime Minister Li's visit to France last July as guest of honor of President Macron for the French National Day. It is a particular pleasure to share this stage with my friends Matt Sabu, whom I met here last year for the first time, and Penny Mordaunt. It must be a measure of the Shangri-La's attraction that I meet Penny for the first time 10,000 kilometers away from our respective homes. I have to say, though, that I did not come alone, as you mentioned, Dr. Chipman. Last year, we had a bit of competition with your predecessor, Penny, as to which of our two countries sent more frigates to the Indo-Pacific area. Gavin Williamson argued a bit over whether it was 2 or 3 per year. So today, I upped my game, and I came with a full carrier strike group, complete with aircraft carrier, destroyers, tankers, 20 Rafale, Hawkeye, and helicopters, hoping that you would be kind enough not to reciprocate. Joke aside, this mighty instrument of power projection, birthed only a few miles from here, means a lot to me. A year ago, President Macron delivered an important speech at Garden Island in Australia and made the case for the emergence of an Indo-Pacific axis with France, India, and Australia as its backbone, but with a strong cooperation with other countries in the region and with Europeans, of course. What better incarnation of such a project than this carrier strike group? As she sailed away from France, she participated in the campaign to eradicate ISIS in Syria, where our British and Australian friends are key partners alongside the US. Once in the Indian Ocean, she took part in a series of advanced exercises with the Indian Navy and did the same a few days ago with the Australian and the Japanese Navy. She will participate in the coming days to joint exercises with the Singaporean Navy and Air Force. In this deployment, the Carrier Strike Group will have integrated Danish, British, American, Italian, Australian, and Portuguese vessels and officers from many other countries. This, to me, is policy in action. India, Australia, those two great democratic nations, have just renewed their leaderships by electing the incumbent, something my government is looking at with no small measures of self-interest. Our relationships with the newly elected leaders are already very strong, and we will do our utmost to strengthen them even further. This cooperation is more necessary than ever, given Asia's evolving security order and its challenges. It takes no Kissinger to see the building blocks of a global confrontation taking shape here in Asia. We see it in trade wars, tech wars, currency wars, wars of words, and the occasional brush between two aircraft or two ships. And this is only the beginning. So, what is the position of France in all this? Matt, one of your predecessors once joked to me that France and the US were nice where there talk of freedom of navigation and rules-based order. But the bottom line was, the Westerners came and then went back to the safety of Toulon or Honolulu, while we, mean you, are stuck here with our bulky neighbors. I challenge this assertion. France is not going anywhere because we are part of the region. We have territories here. We have more than 1.6 million inhabitants, several islands with different statutes, vast exclusive economic zones, and the responsibility that goes with the territory. The evolving security order affects us too. We have just completed our Indo-Pacific strategy, and its assessment of the dynamics in the region is not particularly uplifting. I mentioned the growing strategic competition. Multilateralism is receding, and its core values, like sovereign equality, non-interference, respect of borders, are on the wane. Speed, tech, and reach are reducing the geostrategic space. Djibouti illustrates this. With its balcony on the Indian Ocean, it has become a sort of Babylon on the Horn, a place of French, Chinese, American, Japanese, German, and even Italian accents. A reduced space is a space where frictions will happen faster and more often. But the Indo-Pacific is also an area of harder military capabilities, of unpredictability, where coercion can take place without drawn swords. Faced with this reality, we have identified 5 main priorities in our action. First, we will protect our sovereign interest, our nationals, our territories, and our exclusive economic zone in the region. Our forces will be ready to face any kind of threats, whether from terrorism, organized crime, and any attempts to undermine French sovereignty. Some of these threats are straightforward. Some are insidious. We will confront them anyway. We will organize our presence, our pre-positioned forces, our temporary deployments to ensure a robust defense of our interests. It will rest on 5 military commands, 3 sovereign bases, and more than 7,000 military personnel in the area. We will not only keep aggressors at bay, we will also disrupt traffickers. In 2018 only, our forces seized 15 tons of drugs in the Indian Ocean, enough to dope all the region's sharks into oblivion. Second, we will contribute to regional stability through our military and security cooperation. I mention India and Australia as partners of choice, obviously, but we have other key partners in the region, and I would like to single out in particular Malaysia. Matt, last time I visited your country, I was fascinated by the extent of our cooperation with your magnificent fleet of Airbus 400s and submarines, and all the things our military do together. France supports the building of a regional security architecture and the centrality of ASEAN. We've taken steps to work closer to ASEAN different structures, in particular the ADMM+, where France would bring its operational know-how. Third, we will preserve, with our partners, free and open access to maritime lines of communication. This is normally where I walk the elephant in the room. What is at stake goes beyond the prosperity of Europe and the preservation of trade lanes that are vital to the world. This is a question of principle. Where rules are no longer the boundary of ambition, what security can there be for smaller states in the region? What is the meaning of sovereign equality, that cardinal principle of the UN? As for us, we will go about this issue in our own steady, non-confrontational, but obstinate way. We will continue to sail more than twice a year in the South China Sea. There will be objections, there will be dubious maneuvers at sea. But we will not be intimidated into accepting any fait accompli. because what international law condemns, how could we condone? We will also call for all those who share this view to join in, as have several European officers and indeed British helicopters on our ships when we sail through the South China Sea. Fourth, we will contribute to strategic stability through multilateral action. Think nuclear proliferation in particular. One way to solve this is to fall in love with Kim Jong-un and engage in symmetry. As for us, we support love among nations and are in favor of diplomatic efforts. We just hope they will lead to complete, verifiable, irreversible nuclear disarmament. Our contribution, however, will be in the implementation of sanctions. We have, for instance, deployed important air assets in Japan and in the Republic of Korea, as well as frigate, to monitor the nightly rendezvous of tankers doing illegal transshipments. 5, and last, we will draw the lessons of the incredible accumulation of catastrophic climate events that happened recently in the region. Our forces were often involved in them, whether to help, as we did by deploying an Airbus 400 to Indonesia during a typhoon last year, or to be helped, as when our Rafale aircraft had to be diverted towards the same welcoming Indonesia this year because of a terrible weather. This should send alarm bells. Smaller island states are at serious risk, and armed forces have capabilities that can help. We should join forces. France will be launching a program to improve our anticipation and mitigation of risks to the environment, and we hope to cooperate with as many partners as possible. Having vastly exceeded my time, I will now conclude. I've tried to outline some of the region's challenges and how my country fits in the picture. History is replete with big power competition. The Punic Wars started when Rome and Carthage fought over an island in a strait. What ensued was 100 years of war, followed by 500 years of domination. That was 2,000 years ago. And the island was called Sicily. The slowly assembling parts of a tragedy do not mean that a tragedy is inevitable. But pretending to ignore what looms does not help. As for us, we believe we can chart our own way, avoid confrontation, and carry a distinctive voice. We believe that we can rally our friends and all the people of goodwill who want to join us in the defense of the rule-based international system. And with this, in a peaceful, multilateral, but robust way, we hope to accompany the vast rebalancing that is taking place in the region. Thank you very much.
Florence, if I may, thank you very much for that detailed, and I use your word, robust statement, whose theme, I think, can be summarized as follows, which is that France is a resident power in the Asia-Pacific, and therefore your Indo-Pacific strategy is part of France's national security policy, which I think is what leads to your wanting to continue to carry a distinctive voice in this region. I have 15 people so far who have mastered the technological challenge of putting their card in the machine and seeking the floor. What I will do is take half a dozen or so comments and questions and then come back to the panel. And if everybody is disciplined, we might also have a second round. I'll give priority to those who haven't yet had a chance to take the floor. And first on my list is Jeffrey Ordeniel.
I'd like to address my question to Defense Minister Muhammad Sabu. When Malaysia ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1996, it made several declarations, and one of which is that Malaysia would not allow military exercises or maneuvers in your exclusive economic zone. In essence, the Malaysian position seems to be closer to the Chinese interpretation of international law. And recently, your Prime Minister said that the presence of warships in the South China Sea is sending the wrong signal and is not healthy for peace and stability. We all know that the US has been sending warships to the South China Sea to assert freedom of navigation through the so-called FONOPs. So my question is, does Malaysia disagree with the US on freedom of navigation issues? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And could I have Shashank Joshi, please?
Thank you. To the Secretary of State, she mentioned challenges to norms, and that included norms in cyberspace at the beginning. Both of France and the UK have established a strong naval presence and are challenging, pushing back at challenges to freedom of navigation. What are your countries doing about challenges to norms in cyberspace and aggression in cyberspace? What would you point to in that domain?
Thank you. Liselott Odgaard. Go ahead.
I would like to address two questions to the Minister of Defense, Pali. First, to Madame Pali, about the forces you have or France has in the Indo-Pacific, can you clarify what role they play in relation to the two big powers, the US and China? And secondly, you mentioned the European contributions to the French deployments, but how much of a European contribution is there once you reach Southeast Asia and the Far East? And how do you see the prospects of greater European contributions to what seems to be very much a French-led effort at the moment? Thank you.
Thank you. And next, Sophia Yan. Yeah, you mustn't press your button again because then it turns off. Sophia Yan.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman.
Yeah.
There we go. My question is for Secretary Mordaunt. Now, you mentioned in your speech that the Royal Navy remains committed to this region. Does that mean that the UK will continue its commitment in terms of conducting freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea? My second question is about the cybersecurity risks posed in terms of Huawei's involvement, potential involvement in the UK's 5G networks. There's certainly domestic political turmoil going on in the UK, but there was a decision that was slated to come in the next couple of weeks. Now, security risks don't wait for politicians to get their act together. I wonder what your views are on the threats that Huawei could pose, and if Huawei is allowed to be working with the UK when it comes to building 5G, what reassurances can you give? Any safeguards that you think could help assuage concerns?
Thanks, Sophia. And from Indonesia, Dewi Fortuna Anwar. Dewi?
Thank you, John. My questions will be first to the two officials from Europe. Both of you mentioned about support for ASEAN centrality. And we know that one of the strategic objective of ASEAN is to enhance its strategic autonomy. And that also means, building regional resilience or not having too many external powers being involved in the region. But at the same time now, we seem to see greater involvement of external powers in this region. So how do we square this circle and having, in the sense that the real politics is that you need to have more and more extra-regional powers trying to enforce rules-based international order, but at the same time, dealing with the idea of having this strategic autonomy. And I will ask also Bapak from Malaysia, Pak Badu, the question about the South China Sea as well, and the role of these external powers, how are we, we in ASEAN has always said, we want to engage all sides. Is it really possible? Is it really possible for us to have this kind of soft, inclusive regional architecture when we have these real challenges on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you. And next is Sadi Danramali Kashia.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. Thank you very much. Talking of Asia's evolving security orders and its challenges, as yesterday, Prime Minister Lee had pointed out that he has warned against conflicts. A huge, big threat of conflict is looming around Asia, around the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf. If that conflict takes place, Iran has outlined its action, and they say that Strait of Hormuz shall be blocked. And if it is blocked for days, weeks, or months, the price of oil should skyrocket. And all the countries except USA, who are self-sufficient in oil supply, shall be affected, including Japan, China, most of the countries in ASEAN, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and this shall bring a stoppage of all the development that we are talking about. I feel that this is the time when UN should indulge itself into some sort of a resolution from the Security Council, and if there's any requirement, the instrument is sanctions from UN.
Thank you very much. And your question is, does the panel agree? We'll take that as your question. Aaron Connolly?
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. I'd like to direct my question to YB Matsabu. I'm curious, in your speech, you seem to draw an equivalence between the United States and China and the role that they have played in, as you say, escalating tensions in the South China Sea. But there has been a Chinese Coast Guard vessel off the coast of Sabah, off Laconia Shoal, for the past 3 years. I want to ask you, do you really believe that China and the US play equal roles in creating tensions in the South China Sea? And just second, when you were in opposition, and when your deputy, Senator Liu Chintong, was in opposition in 2013, he called for a robust response to the presence of this Chinese Coast Guard ship. How have your views on the presence of that ship changed since you came into office? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more intervention before coming back to the panel. When I do, I'll do it in reverse order, if I may. So I'm giving warning, Florence Parly, then Penny Morden, then Matt Sabu, but I'll take one more question from Michael Fulilove.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. Michael Fulilove from Australia. I'd like to first compliment Madame Parly for her excellent speech, which I thought combined tough-mindedness with a sense of humour, which is always welcome in the third plenary, so thank you for that. Let me say, I also heard your President's speech in Garden Island, and I think most Australians welcome France's obstinate efforts to help uphold the rules-based order in Asia, of which we're all beneficiaries. Let me ask you one question, Madame Parly, about values, which I think you mentioned. Last year, one of the delegates in this room was the Canadian Michael Kovrig of Crisis Group. And this year he's not with us. And his detention has consequences for his family, of course, but also for China, because I think it dampens intellectual exchange and makes it harder for others to visit China to engage with Chinese policymakers. So may I ask you to address the question of his detention from the perspective of China's interests? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Florence Parly.
So thank you for giving me the floor. First, I would like to answer the question about the role that plays our forces in Indo-Pacific. As I said in my preliminary speech, we are an Indo-Pacific country. I know this is a bit surprising, but this is reality, so we have to be there to protect our citizens, to protect our territories, and to contribute also to the stability of the region, a region that we know is threatened in many manners. It's a region of opportunities, but it's also a region where tensions are there. So because we have territories, because we have citizens, we have permanent forces in the area. And we are probably one of the only European countries having this very particular position. I'm projecting myself in the future where the United Kingdom will not be part of the European Union. So we are there, and we try to develop common exercises with our partners, I mean our regional partners, and that's exactly the meaning of the air strike group that sailed from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean and up to Singapore. We want to have our own way, and on top of that, to demonstrate that we are able to coordinate with all the goodwill nations that are willing to contribute to the stability of the region. That's the meaning of our presence, and that's the meaning of the presence of the Charles de Gaulle's aircraft carrier. The other question was about the European contribution. How can we develop a European contribution as Europe is very far from the Indo-Pacific area? I think that we have to convince, and we had convinced our European partners that the Indo-Pacific is a very key area, not only from an economic perspective, but also from a strategic and military perspective due to the tensions I just mentioned before. So we have stakes in terms of maritime awareness, and this is something that we should develop together. We created together Maritime Fusion Center in Madagascar as an example of what can be done at the European level to develop not only the presence but also the commitment of Europe in such a region. How can we support Asian centrality and extra-regional powers in the region? I think there is no contradiction at all between those two aspects. It's clear that we are in a region where Asian is absolutely central. There is no doubt about that. But we see also that other big powers play a major role. So is it good to leave them by themselves, or is it better to be there with local partners and with smaller states? And I think that the second answer is the best one. last question about cyber. Yes, we have, with the UK, developed a strong naval presence, and I think that we are developing together, but I'm sure Penny will elaborate more on this in cyber. On our side, we have analyzed the potential threat of cyber, and it's huge. It's huge for economy, it's huge for the protection of our citizens. That's why in our military programming law, we have decided to increase significantly the investment on cyber. We will invest 1.6 billion in the next 7 years in cyber. And we have also elaborated a kind of doctrine which is a cyber defense doctrine. So yes, we fully consider cyber as a threat. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, to start with the question, I think it was from the Economist on cyber. I think that we, as well as developing our defensive and offensive capabilities, two further areas where I think we are going to need to do much more in the future. The first is on developing a policy that can really help us make good decisions, to understand the types of activity that are going on, to classify those types of activity and understand what is a proportionate and appropriate response. We need to work with others to develop that common understanding, and I think that is one area that you can see us do more on in the future. And then secondly, really linking in these new capabilities with more traditional and more conventional capabilities that we have. And I made an announcement a few days ago about some additional investment we're putting in to do that, particularly for the British Army. Secondly, turning to the question, which I think was from the Telegraph, just on enforcing freedom of navigation. I'm not going to, as you would expect, make any announcements about future ship operations. Sorry to disappoint you in that, but we absolutely reserve our right to do that. And as I said in my speech, these are important rules and important principles, and they need to be upheld and they need to be enforced. But of course, there are many ways of doing that, and I will be discussing those this afternoon. With regard to, I would just take issue with the description of the UK being in political turmoil. It is true, life is not dull, but I don't think we are in turmoil. I'm here doing my job. Other ministers are doing their jobs. And we are testing our political institutions to the hilt, but they are strong institutions, and we will find a way through. And I think this is a sign not of a nation's weakness, but a sign of its strength, that it can have these debates and conversations and trust the people to make decisions. With regard to the issue of 5G, I think that Prime Minister Lee set out this very well yesterday. These are judgments to be made. There are vulnerabilities, for example, of just having one supplier. All nations facing these decisions have to look at the detail. They have to weigh that up, and we will come to a decision and make an announcement on that shortly. But what I would say is that we will not compromise on our security, and we will not compromise our security relationships with our key partners. And I think rather than pose the question at nations who are facing these decisions on what suppliers to use, we should also be posing questions to nations and companies who do not want to adhere to the principles that we would like to see in our suppliers. And I think that that is what we should focus on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Matt Sabu.
Yes, we have to respect COC and UNCLOS. South China Sea now is a very important area. We know the Strait of Malacca, more than 100,000 ships pass through that area. So this trading area is very important. So we don't want this area to become the show of power between the two big power, either USA or China. We have defense diplomacy because we are in ASEAN, especially Malaysia. We cannot have a war with China or Russia. We are too small. We are not strong, but we have sovereignty. This is very important for these two countries to respect in this area. Then we don't want to import what happened in the Persian Gulf to South China Sea. To show the power, then after that, one gentleman from India mentioned just now, if anything happened in the Strait of Hormuz, the world will suffer. At the same time also, if anything happened in South China Sea, the world also will suffer. So we have to increase our defense diplomacy. We love America. We also love China. So both of them must know their lover. Take care of the lover. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So here are the rules of engagement for the next 14 minutes or so. I'll try to bring in 6 or 7 comments and questions, but I'm hoping that they will all be very crisp, and then I'll give each of the panelists a minute and a half each to deliver what they consider to be their most important concluding message to the audience. So could I ask first Rufino Lopez?
Oh, thank you, John. I thought I will not have this chance. Anyway, thank you for the panelists, their views, both from Asia and from Europe. This century is arguably the Asian century. Perhaps this is true. Being a country situated in the middle of the Asia-Pacific region, the Philippines, a small state, cannot be more proud if this century is to be the Asian century. However, there is also cause to be concerned and perhaps to be worried of the aggressive push to change the existing regional security framework, while the Philippines welcomes change, especially if that change is for the betterment of the region. What is wrong, actually? My question is, does Asia-Pacific region really need a new regional security architecture? If so, what form? And should it take, and whose interest should it be considered?
Thank you. Ewan Graham.
My question goes to Secretary Mordaunt. Secretary, you talked about the UK in terms of win-win principles and projecting values. An aircraft carrier, however, and as a naval reservist, I think I don't need to tell you this, but is fundamentally about power projection, as your French counterpart has herself underlined today. And I believe if the UK is to send aircraft carriers to this region in future, that regional states, including China, are very unlikely to view that in terms of a win-win outcome. That may be a risk that the UK is willing to shoulder, but I think we need to be upfront in terms of that risk, and further that it sets up an expectation amongst allies and partners that there will be an expectation that the UK delivers on that into the future. Because to my mind, and I put it to you, if there is a question around UK ships visiting Asia, it is less about the size of those ships rather than the frequency and consistency with which they visit.
Thank you. From Japan, Eko Doden.
My question goes to the Defense Minister of Malaysia. Thank you very much, Dr. Chipman. Minister, you have referred to non-traditional security threat and the rise of extremism in the region. What would you say would be the implication of the Sri Lankan attack, which happened recently? In Southeast Asia, where there are said to be pockets of resentment that can be ignited or taken advantage of those extremist groups. What is the extent of the need for the transnational measures like information sharing in order to address these activities that are both transnational and ubiquitous?
Thank you very much. Janadia Kawati-Gibson.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Chipman. My question is for Secretary Mordaunt and Minister Pali. You've talked a bit about cybersecurity, but I was wondering if you could elaborate your views on the implications of cybersecurity and the development of artificial intelligence on Asia's security stability. You mentioned cybersecurity in terms of your own policies, but how it will influence us and perhaps how you could also share your experience to the region. Thank you.
Thank you. At this point, I should make an editorial comment, which is that it seems good news that we ensured there was a special session this afternoon at the Shangri-La Dialogue on cyber capability development, defense implications, because this has been a persistent theme, to use a technical phrase, of this plenary. But there'll be more this afternoon for those interested. Prasath Paramaprasan.
Thanks. My question is for the Malaysian Defense Minister, Mohamed Sabu. Minister, since you've taken up your post, you've spoken frequently and also very honestly and candidly about the severe limitations that Malaysia faces in terms of its capabilities and the challenges for its military modernization. And since then, we've seen Malaysia take a number of steps that are very promising and also some of them being long-term, including articulating a defense white paper and the conception of Malaysia as a maritime nation that was announced by the Malaysian Prime Minister. Based on what you've seen so far, do you sense that what has been done to date is sufficient to address the capabilities gaps that you've mentioned? And if not, what are some of the other steps that Malaysia can take to help sort of narrow those gaps? Thank you.
Thank you. Yingli Zhang.
Thank you. 下面我要用中文来提问。所以还想
I will speak Mandarin here. Thank you, Dr. Chipman. I also would like to thank the three ministers on the stage. I'm from China. I'm from the Defense University of China. So my question is to Pali. I can say that this freedom of navigation is the common issue of the Asian countries, also our common benefit. But of course, any freedom of navigation will be conditional, will have a precondition. That means it cannot endanger the sovereignty of the relevant countries as well as the security and interests of the relevant countries. Otherwise, it will trigger the resistance of the countries, including China. So this will result in more lack of freedom. This will further reduce the freedom. So my two questions. First question is that in the 21st century, we would like to maintain the security of Asia Pacific. Other than sending our military to maintain this security, is there any other better measures, for example, through dialogue, conversation, or cooperation? For example, this is what our military is doing in other areas. The second question is that we think that rules in maintaining the security of Asia Pacific has got a very important role to play. That is the rules. Do you think that China and the ASEAN countries are now negotiating our code of conduct? The code of conduct that is being negotiated between China and ASEAN, is it also part of these rules? Once this code of conduct has been rolled out, will that play a permanent role, a long-standing role on maintaining the stability of South China Sea and Asia Pacific? Thank you.
We're going to take two more brief interventions, and then I will take the panelists in the order in which they originally spoke. So Matt Sabu first, then Penny Mordaunt, and then Florence Parly. But two brief interventions. First, Jiran bin Madzia.
Right, a question for the Malaysian Defense Minister, and thank you, Dr. Chipman. First thing is that I've been hearing there's a certain change in posture, including the cancellation of a multinational amphibious exercise scheduled in Malaysia because it was deemed too aggressive. So is the new Pakatan Harapan government having a change in policy? Because there's also been the no longer publicization of the US Navy destroyers docking in at Kota Kinabalu, normally on their way or coming back from a foreign ops. Well, in the past, the Royal Malaysian Navy always tweeted it out. The second thing is the situation in East Malaysia on the eastern coast of Sabah. The Malaysian government seems to be engaged in an infinity war of constant patrolling the border with no end game in sight. So perhaps you can tell us how this ends, really, to quote David Petraeus's famous line. What is the end game for Malaysia in regard to the threat posed by armed groups in the Philippines? Does it end with us hanging the last Abu Sayyaf guys in Kuala Lumpur, or a peaceful negotiation, or something or another? And I think we would tweet, a couple of people have already asked about the Chinese Coast Guard vessel parked at Luconia Shoals, and I think you haven't answered that question, so perhaps you could answer that too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another example of persistent engagement from the floor. Final point from Pierre Noël.
Thank you, John. Question for Minister Parly. You very strongly emphasized that France would face off any threat to its sovereignty in the region. Just wanted to know if this was a statement of principle or if you had specific threats in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, a minute and a half each to conclude by 1 p.m. so that ministers can attend the lunch that Minister Ung is shortly to host. Mat Sabu first.
So many questions for me. But it's good. For the terrorists, there is no religious border. But whether the Muslim or non-Muslim, in New Zealand, Sri Lanka, and all the worship place, the masjid, church, is in Iskandaria in Egypt. So we understand that terrorists is no border and no ideology, certain ideology, and no religion. So we have to fight with them in soft way and hard way. But I am a very appreciate and the rule of the Prime Minister of New Zealand, how they she faced with the accident in New Zealand. We appreciate him. That's the way the world leaders should behave when that thing happen in their country. So I salute the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And we also have to study deep inside these terrorists, who's their father and mother, because they have a lot of money. They have a very sophisticated weapon. If they're an NGO, I think they cannot afford to have that modern weapon. And now in Idlib, you can see they have even a rocket launcher. So who's their father and mother? We must, our intelligence must share and expose who's their mother and father. Then we can reduce their activity throughout the world. We have no border. We can discuss. They also borderless. They can react any way they want. So this is a threat that we're facing now. But in Southeast Asia, we share our intelligence. We have a very strong collaboration, and we try. Then same thing. It's between the border Sabah and Philippines. We have joint patrol together with 3 countries, Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. They reduce a lot all the kidnap for ransom and kidnap for money. Of course, there are so many things happen there, but we reduce a lot because our cooperation is very, very strong in that area. Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, TCA. Then we know China is a border with us. China is near to us. So any day changing of the policy will affect us. That's why I know sometimes they send a Coast Guard the Coast Guard, the China Coast Guard is bigger than Malaysia warship. So how can we going to chase them? So we cannot fight with them, but we will always talk to them, defend diplomacy, respect sovereignty, and if they send a warship there, then America also will challenge them. So when the elephant fight, the grass will suffer. When elephant laugh, the grass will suffer. That's mentioned by Prime Minister Lee last night. So this, we must actively defend diplomacy, that we must meet together many times. It's not the first time or second time, third time, many times to dialogue, because we want to keep the peace, neutrality zone in this area, especially in South China Sea. So we want to upgrade, and we want to have a dialogue and defend diplomacy and respect the law. UNCLOS, everything must be upheld. Everybody, when we in big power, they come and they give speech. They respect sovereignty, they respect the UNCLOS, they respect COC, but their behavior is different. That is we are the small country, especially ASEAN, we must unite together to face this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Penny Mordaunt.
Thank you. Well, I think my time is best spent answering Ewan's question, I think it was. So by power projection, what we mean, that is shorthand for being able to do what you know needs to be done. And when the two carriers are in service, they will be used for many things. They will be backdrops to trade deals and negotiations. Their big decks will be used to distribute aid. They will be used for cementing partnerships, for joint training, for building capacity. And yes, there will be times when they will be used as a deterrent, and they will be used for offensive situations. But what matters is the context in which you are deploying them and the clear purpose that they are there to serve. I think it would be very unusual if Big Liz, as we affectionately call her, did not visit at some point this region. But I would just remind you that when she recently visited New York City, that was not a hostile act.
Thank you very much. Florence Parly.
Well, first questions about the threats. Do we consider threats in principle or in particular? Again, we are in a region of tensions, so there are many kinds of threats, and we have to be ready to face them. So I have no particular idea. I just mentioned terrorism, trafficking, drugs, and so on, and I think we should be prepared to face them. I will like to answer the question raised by the Chinese representative. And I would like to tell you that we strongly believe in rules-based order, and we strongly believe in international law, among which freedom of navigation. And we consider that the fait accompli is clearly not in accordance with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. On top of, I would like to add that France does not take position on territories disputes. As I said, we feel very concerned by what's going on in the area, but this is not our position to take position on these questions. The last question was about the Code of Conduct. Yes, we strongly support this initiative because it's in the spirit of the multilateralism we would like to develop. Still, we consider that the code itself will have to comply with the international law. And again, we strongly believe in this.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope all of you will join me in thanking the three defense ministers who have spoken and who have given us such an extraordinary opportunity to understand Asia's regional security order. I wish you all a very good lunch. The special session starts at 3 o'clock this afternoon, and I hope you find those discussions as stimulating as those this morning. Thank you very much.